great to hear that companies have it down pat. You know, three-phase program. It's been in policy since the early 80s. It's been around for a long time. Every federal agency with over $100 million in extramural R&D spending. What that means is the federal agency government department spends over $100 million externally, not internally to the labs, but externally on companies a year. In that category, 3.2% of that funding is taxed for the SBIR program. So all government departments in that category, there's quite a few. I represent the Air Force. The Air Force is one of 3 services that have dedicated SBIR programs within the DoD. DoD itself has its own SBIR program, and then there's other government departments like the Department of Energy, who has their own SBIR program. I will say, for everyone who's not familiar with it, every SBIR program is built very differently. Even the way we do it inside the Air Force is very depending on who you're working with in the Air Force with executing the SBIR program. Not to mention, we use contracts, Department of Energy uses grants, which is completely different. So there's more to dig in with every government department that we're working on, and I'd recommend anybody who's interested, do the homework there.
So Jason, to follow up to that, how can a company get involved in the SBIR process?
Great question. Again, it depends. We're working together as a unit to try to make this even easier to access. So I'll pitch what we're doing with the Air Force, and then and provide some other kind of signposts for the other government departments, and hopefully Manny can jump back in here and talk more about the DOE. But on the Air Force side, the easiest way to get involved is to check out the Air Force website. For us specifically at AF Ventures, you can go to the appworks.af.mil website, and we have a process there that should provide a step-by-step engagement if you're interested in learning more. Corsha was a company who used our open topic process, which is $50,000 phase 1 for 3 months of work, $750,000 as a base for a phase 2, plus options for additional funding depending on other criteria that change depending on the market and depending on the funds that we have available. And then phase 3, which is a follow-on contract outside of SBIR, but builds on that work. And for the DoD, there's a portal, the DSIP portal. That's where you can go and find all of the DoD's offerings. So you can see the Air Force, Navy, Army, all have different topics that you can apply to. The AF Ventures, we have one topic. It's called the open topic. Any company with any idea can apply. The topic is built around the company being able to pitch that their technology that they're interested in working on has applicability to the Air Force and meets an Air Force requirement. We do post focus areas, technologies that we're currently considering or interested in, but our program is 100% built around accessing and leveraging development efforts that you're interested in doing and seeing where they align with Air Force needs. For us, it's not just about the initial investment, but it's about the transition of that product or service, that resulting product or service, to the Air Force. And so what that means for companies is we fund the non-recurring government contracts, or the R&D contracts is kind of what we call them, but with the intent of getting to recurring revenue. So for us, it's all about that transition. And generally speaking, for the SBIR program, is built around commercialization. So if you read the SBIR statutes and policies, so all programs do these in different ways, but that's generally our focus. Now, more often than not, you're going to find specific technology topics, and those topics, again, are going to depend on the agency or the department that runs the program. The DSIP website has all of the DoD's topics, and so you can go and see where that intersects with your work, and so where you think you might be able to do some novel development effort that the department's looking for. I'll say every other agency does it differently. And going to check out their websites. Every SBIR program by law has to have a website. So they're all accessible on the web, and I'm certainly not the expert there, so I'll defer pretending to be one. and just recommend that's the approach that folks take.
Great. So we had a question from the audience, so I'm going to roll into Maria's question as well. So in addition to the basics of an SBIR, what's the best way to actually submit SBIR, find out those SBIR opportunities? And then the question that is also related to it is, do you have a set RFP process, or is this something that can happen when somebody's ready to apply?
Yeah, I'm happy to take it, and I'm sure every other panelist is very experienced on that process. But so for the first question, I think, again, to what Jason mentioned and Anusha too, right, there are so many different topics for an SBIR cycle with each agency. There are 11 participating agencies, and they all have like maybe around 5 to 20 open topics at any given time. I think the important thing to highlight is that you can apply for an SBIR when you are ready to apply for an SBIR. So there are 4 cycles throughout the calendar year, or maybe it's 3. I think it's 3 cycles. Someone will correct me. Thank you, Jason. 3 cycles, and it's generally there are some topics that are standard and sort of like the AFWorks open topic that are generally that topic is open and with every single Air Force SBIR cycle. And then there are other topics that are really sort of time bound and are maybe open for one cycle in particular, but you might not see it in the next cycle. And usually I think at Decode, we see that for more of the research driven topics that are very specific to what like a research lab or a research organization is working on. So I think the best way is to, honestly, if you are looking for the right topic for your company or for whatever stage you're in, is to like set a Google alert for when the topics are released. There are pre-release dates for every single SBIR cycle where you can just see the topics that are about to be open for submission. And they are, because again, it's a mandated program and it's a really huge program, those dates really don't change over the course of the year. And so you can always sort of manage like, all right, October 15th is when the next round is going to open. I'm going to make sure to check the website. And I would start with looking on the SBIR website in general, if you are trying to look both across civilian and DoD. And while it's not the most user-friendly government website, there is a search function, and I would just recommend, filtering through to what's relevant to you. And then if you know in particular that you are interested in working with a specific agency, then I would definitely go and check that specific agency's website and specific agency's open topics to sort of stay on track. But again, the really wonderful thing about SBIR is that it's a process and it's a recurring process. So you don't feel very sort of limited if you don't make one cycle or if you miss a topic that was relevant to you in one cycle, because chances are that it will be a topic that is available for you to submit in the next one.
Yeah, I think it's funny that you mentioned that the start dates don't change, but sometimes the dispense dates do change and they tend to get extended. And so it's always good to go back and check the websites, keep updated, refresh the page, even as you're trying to submit your SBIRs, and look to see what's out there.
And so the instructions change too.
Yes, they do.
Fun fact.
Sometimes there's additional information that is required. And that kind of leads into Anusha's question. Since you have successfully won an SBIR, how can you recommend some things for success for SBIR proposals and for proposal writing and just going through the process overall?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jen. So, just logistically, there's a few things that have helped us set ourselves up for success. One is, I know that DSIP, if you're trying to stay on top of the different proposal opportunities, does have a notification service. So you can kind of subscribe and get emails as to when different opportunities, BAAs come out. So that's been really helpful. The other is there are templates and kind of proposal templates, all of the supporting documentation available through DSIP, as well as the different SBIR sites. That's helpful. And I'll say for us, this was our first SBIR, and so it's been a great experience. I think for us, going through and really embracing that full cycle of the phase 1 to the phase 2 was helpful. So the phase 1 tends to be, as I mentioned, this kind of early customer discovery, requirements gathering experience, and that really poised us to write a phase 2 that was driven more around the what and the why rather than the how. I mean, as a technology company, it's really easy to fall into, look at this really cool widget I have, but I think it's important to focus the proposal on the problem space and the need for the customer in the specific organization, and really spend that time in the phase 2 to look at what are you actually addressing, what is integration going to look like, because these are complex environments that you often get dropped into. And so, really utilizing that time and focusing on the customer and their space. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. Some people have different philosophies on accomplishing SBIRs, and I will throw this out to Ria and Anusha. Some people say that they want to do it all themselves in a company, within a company, and some people say that you should hire somebody to help you make sure that you've dotted your I's and crossed your T's before you submit your package. And I'd like to hear the perspective from both of you. So I'll start with you, Ria, and see what you have to say.
Thanks, Jen. This is a fun question. So I guess like the Decode perspective, and again, Decode is a technology accelerator, so we help a whole host of high growth tech companies better understand how to navigate the federal market. And so for our companies, one thing that we advise against is to be very careful with how you resource your funding, right? And I think AFWorks in particular has made it very, very founder friendly, and really hoping to not have these companies have to outsource their proposal in order to get across the line. And so I would say that you can do it yourself. It's really hard, and there are a whole host of people who are happy to help advise you along the way, but it's really meant and geared, and each, I think, iteration of the SBIR proposal is meant to make it a little bit more founder friendly in terms of requirements and in terms of instruction language. However, if you, I think, are a little bit more cash flux, and SBIR is one of the many avenues that you are pursuing, it might be worth looking into a proposal writer. But I think that the same reason you look into a proposal writer for a SBIR is the same reason you would look for a proposal writer for any sort of government proposal, and be very careful around what you are getting out of that contract, who you are working with, and what your reasoning is. Because at the end of the day, you really shouldn't have to rely on a third-party vendor to help you with SBIR. And I would say be very careful about the terms of agreement, because usually what these companies will do is have a sort of smaller fee up front. And then every time, if you win phase 1, if you win phase 2, they get a really strong percentage of that margin on that contract. And that's where you fall into a trap of giving away quite a bit of revenue that could be yours to this proposal writer. So I'd be very careful too of the terms of agreements, because we've seen quite a few of those that are not very friendly in future wins, not necessarily the proposal you are working on right now with that company.
Anusha, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think that's great advice. There are oftentimes these hidden terms when you use companies to come in and help and double check on the proposal writing. I will say one thing that helped us up front was doing a workshop prior, where they give you tips before you jump into the proposal writing, just to say, okay, here are good starting templates to start from, things like that. I think, we did one with CIT. There's a number of organizations that offer that.
Great. So Jason, I would like to direct this question to you. There have been a couple questions that have rolled through the Q&A, and so I'll just kind of combine them all into one. Do you have to have a product in order to compete for an SBIR, such as some sort of technology, or can you be a service, or can you provide something else? Can you talk about that, please?
So this is a great question, and again, my answer is going to be it depends. Unfortunately, because every agency is different, and their appropriations are different, and if you want, if you can't fall asleep, I highly recommend picking up a copy of the Air Force FM manual and trying to understand all the different funding categories through which we can actually allocate the funding that we have from the Congress to spend on these awards. So within the Air Force, and really within the DoD broadly, we fund contracts. Kind of the first kind of major difference between the DoD and other services. Other services use grants. You can fund different things with grants than you can with contracts. The second activity is that our funding comes from the R&D appropriations. The Air Force, the number is 3,600, so it's a funding category. And in that funding category, there's only certain things we can allocate our funding on, and it's in the research and development, test and evaluation category. So there's a span of activities that we can fund with that appropriated funds. We cannot fund, for example, services. So I can't use this funding to procure a service so that that service is then working on behalf of the department. It has to be RDT&E. Now, if you're developing a technology or you're developing the underlying capability to then sell a service in the future, that's different. So if you're developing the underlying technology, you're doing research, development, test, and evaluation of that underlying technology, what we like to refer to kind of as the capability itself, to later be sold as a product or a service, that is completely fundable. In the program policy directive lays this out kind of in greater details of what we can and cannot fund with this funding. But really key on it's the source of funding is R&D funding. So really the SBIR program, you go back back to the 1980s. There's a couple of reasons why the program exists. One, there's a significant amount of economic research that shows that small businesses tend to underinvest in new technological development. And so we want to increase the propensity for small businesses to invest in new technologies. And so our funding, our SBIR funding is supposed to help with that activity. And it's also because private market forces, generally speaking, weren't interested in funding R&D. I mean, if you ever talk to a VC, you know, VCs hate funding R&D, right? They won't fund it. So it's a complementary source of funding that the government provides. We will fund the R&D activity, and certainly in our model, we love partnership with venture capitalists, other private investors, private equity, other sources of for-profit capital to be a complementary investment partner. So, you know, our funding goes to funding R&D activity where other funding might go to support other business aspects of growth in the course of a company's life cycle. So, and that is kind of generally across the board. So think research and development, think the development of a technology or which can go into multiple revenue models, but really it's talking about funding the technology development itself.
And I guess, you know, it's non-diluted funds, which is also a great benefit to the founders and the companies, that they don't have to give up a piece of their company in order to use it. Okay, Manny, you're going to try to see if we can get you back up online again. It looks like you've got at least the ability to mute. So let's see what happens when we unmute. One of the questions that has popped through is like, when is the right time for a company to apply to an SBIR based on their product maturity or the maturity of their company?
I can take a stab at this one. I guess, you know, I'll, again, it depends. I can tell you what worked for us. We actually made a conscious choice to wait until we had hit an early release to apply for a SBIR. And the reason for that is that it allowed us, when we jumped into the phase 2, to quickly move into integration and quickly move into, even beyond that, where now we're going into kind of that ATO process on the Air Force side, which is the authority to operate. And there's a preliminary stage, I believe it's called IATT, interim authority to test. And so that's you know, I think it helps to be at a certain level of maturity so that you can dive right in. And then also I'd say the other thing that's helped us is making sure that we are flexible enough in terms of how we integrate and deploy so that we can work with kind of diverse environments, you know, both legacy systems and forward-leaning, you know, other SBIR companies, for example. So I'd say it's helped being a little farther along there.
I will add that every company is different and every topic is different. So we've had seed stage, angel stage companies, you know, a handful of employees, through Series C, Series D, 450 employees. The SBIR program is capped at 500 employees. So That's kind of the upper limit. And then it depends on the topic. So, you know, for our open topic, a company like Porsche is perfect. I mean, that's exactly, you know, so what an incredible business decision, because it falls right in line with what we're trying to do. You know, it's to pay the development that applies to the Air Force mission, and to pay for those other activities that get Porsche to the point where they're actually in the Air Force. You know, you're selling a capability to the Air Force at that point. You are a prime contractor of the DoD. Not every SBIR topic is like that. I'll tell you that probably the majority of the NIH's SBIR topics are for pharmaceutical development, and they're asking you to develop a specific drug set, for example. So sometimes the agency is going to be asking you as the company to undertake research and development in a certain area. So it's much less about what you're already doing. Maybe it applies to the core competency of your firm, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that agency wants to ultimately buy products and services. And I'll also say this: the DoD is very different than the other federal agencies, because we are a massive procurement arm. So, you know, the NIH doesn't buy the things that it invests in the same way, or the NSF doesn't do that either. The DoD does. Right, so we have a market. I have a market for the SBIR program that I cater to inside the DoD, and so my investment is for the intent of doing things that, like Porsche has been doing with their approach. So again, it depends. You know, if what the topic is, what the agency is asking you to do. But I will say, it's not a limiting factor. You know, that any stage a company is able to apply up to 500 employees, and you've certainly seen a wide breadth of companies.
So Manny, I'm going to give you one more chance to see if we can hear you or not. Do you have anything that you'd like to add from the DOE side? And I saw that you went off mute, but we still can't hear you, unfortunately. Okay, I'm sorry, we're going to have to move on to Rita. I've got another question for you. What do you think is important to the government side, looking at it from the outside, to the program managers, to the programs, to the people, the customers on the government side for the SBIR? What are the things that they're looking for?
Yeah, good question. And I think this is something Anusha said early on, which I completely agree with, right? They're looking for someone to come in and solve a problem, a pain point. And so it's great if you have a lot built out around the technology and like the capabilities, but at the end of the day, if it doesn't paint a clear story of how that capability is going to help that customer solve their problem, you're probably going to lose them a little bit. So making it very clear to them, to your end user or your customer or your technical point of contact, if you're trying to get an MOU signed around how you address a pain point they have, and being very transparent around exactly what your capabilities can do and that timeline is probably some of the most important facets that will make that customer's life a whole lot easier. Because that's I think, and Jason and Manny could definitely talk more about this, right? But on the government side, for these customers and these end users, the really wonderful thing about SBIR is that it gives them access to a whole bunch of technologies and companies and products that they wouldn't normally have access to. And it does that in a way that doesn't chip away from their funding for that pilot stage. And so they're very, from our experience, like customers are usually very open and looking forward to collaborating with you on your scope of work and your capabilities. And so also, I think, make sure you're building in quite a bit of feedback with the customers, because that's the whole value add of the SBIR, is that they have input into that development process with you based on what pain points they have.
So to follow up with that, you're talking about customers. Anusha, since you had to go through this process, how did you find your customers?
Yeah, that's a great question. We ended up really leaning into that customer discovery portion of the phase one, and we really hadn't identified a customer until we got the phase one. And so then I think we had, I'm gonna say, if I remember correctly, nearly 50 conversations with different potential customers throughout the Air Force that, AFWorks helped facilitate some of those conversations. I think we had some connections ourselves. And finally, we found this match with the Digital Engineering Enterprise Office, and then obviously, delve deeper into whiteboards and requirements and the whole bit. But there were actually a couple of different groups on the Air Force side that were interested in signing the MOU. And, that's the thing, is it can actually translate, the phase 1 can translate potentially into multiple phase 2s, right? I think AFWorks has done a really neat job of setting up that initial customer discovery process and connecting the dots.
So, Jason, maybe you can address this. There are rumors out there that if you apply to a phase 1 or a phase 2, that you can only apply to one of them. What is the process or the way to go about if you think that you could fit multiple opportunities?
Well, I'll tell you, we've got an still open solicitation for phase 1s, direct to phase 2s on the SBIR side, and an open phase 1 on the STTR side, Small Business Technology Transfer program, which is an adjacent program to the SBIR program. Some slight differences, but still in the same general lanes for us. You can apply to all three. You can apply to as many different SBIR topics as you want to. You can't get paid twice for the same work. So if you apply for the AFWorks open topic and a DOE activity across the federal space, and that is something that is obviously a big no-no, and we monitor closely. So besides having two contracts that are essentially the same with two different agencies or even within the same organization, you can apply as many topics as you want to. And I think that's a really huge benefit of the program. If you thought you could meet every single topic every cycle, you go for it.
Okay, great. Once that you do have sort of that customer discovery figured out, where or how do you really solidify, and maybe Rhea, I'll ask you this question, how do you solidify that relationship in order to receive funding at the phase 2 and beyond? Because a lot of people talk about phase 1 funding where it's really that R&D customer discovery phase, but then they have a challenge trying to get from phase 1 to phase 2 or further on. And Jason may want to talk about this too after Rhea. It sounds like he's excited for that.
I'll keep it short. I'd love to hear what Jason has to say too, and Anusha. I guess the one piece of advice, again, is that continuous feedback loop. It should really be this open stream of communications between your customer, your committed TPOC, and you. It's not sort of we only touch base when there's a deliverable, or we only touch base when we need them to sign something. Decode has an SBIR as well, and we have bi-weekly check-ins with our Air Force TPOC, just to make sure we're rowing in the same direction when there's new things that are maybe not relevant to SBIR, but generally would be interesting for either parties to know and stay relevant. We share that information with each other, and it's really been great because it's a relationship that is bigger than the SBIR, which leads me to the second point, which is as soon as you get that phase 1 or phase 2, that is your time to find phase 3 sponsors outside of your technical point of contact. I take that back. Almost anyone, any organization, especially within the organization who is sponsoring your SBIR, can be your phase 3 customer, and you can go to a phase 3. So you can leverage your sole source authority, which is really what phase 3 is, as soon as you are awarded your phase 1, which is a pretty big myth. People think you need to complete all the way to phase 2 before starting to plan for phase 3, but you should be planning for that, leveraging phase 3 follow-on production contracts as soon as you hit that phase 1. And that's classic business development, right? And one thing that Decode put together was all of our best relationships across government. How could they leverage our phase 3? So how could we work with DHS for our phase 3? And starting that conversation as soon as we won, because otherwise it's a time catch-up game, and you really have a lot of time to start building your pipeline and getting across that valley of death. There's a lot you can do from day one versus just waiting and then starting to jump in.
Jason, you have anything to add to that?
Now, only to say, maybe we should try to do this again with Manny back on the line, because the DOE's got their own super interesting ways of working with companies, and I think it's good to get a full breadth. I think we're spending a lot of time on the DoD side of the house. Obviously, I'm more than happy to talk about and discuss further. Oh, man, it sounds like Manny made it on.
Hi, it's Manny. Did I finally get through?
Yes.
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay. All right, great. So thanks. I apologize for getting in late here, but yeah. So I did want to point out, I think a lot of the discussion has been kind of on the DoD side. In fact, did want to point out DoD is I think the only federal agency that calls it SBIR. I think all the rest of us call it SBIR, but and DOE, like NIH and NSF, National Science Foundation, are granting agencies. And the one principal thing I do want to point out is that we are really funding you to be successful in taking technology to the private sector primarily. So whether you're applying to develop a new drug through NIH, to us, in terms of new energy technology, we're not looking for you to meet an agency need, because again, if we were doing that like DoD, we would be issuing a contract. We're really looking for you to be, successful in the private sector. And so we have a very fundamental different, our approach is fundamentally different. We're funding phase 1s and phase 2s and looking for you to transition to private investment to move it along further. So I did want to point, that out. And so we do look at the programs very differently, particularly with regard to commercialization. We may be not trying to find you a customer with inside our agency, but we are really relying on you to find a customer for the technology, again, that's appropriate. And I did also want to point out, among the granting agencies, we do have some variations. I think one of the questions that came in pointed out that for NIH and NSF, the focus is on investigator-initiated proposals. So both those agencies are fairly wide open in terms of what they'll accept. NSF is probably the broadest among all the federal agencies. NIH also investigator-initiated, but of course will be constrained primarily to work on health. And DOE, we're a little bit different. We do have very focused topics. We are a mission agency, even though by our name we are called Department of Energy, which we do fund a lot of work in both traditional and renewable energy. We do a lot of work outside of that, everything from additive manufacturing, AI, quantum information systems. So don't also be misled by the name of the agency as to what they would fund. So I'll just stop there. Just wanted to interject with some thoughts, but happy to take any other questions.
So Manny, I'm going to ask you another question since I have you on the line and we can hear you. So there's been questions going back and forth about what is really a phase 3. Is it really full and open? Is it a separate contract? Is it just another formal stage of an SBIR? What is it?
So actually that's probably not the most appropriate question for us granting agencies, because typically granting agencies won't fund many phase 3s.
Yes.
But for us, and occasionally we do, but that would be, for example, maybe one of the DOE national labs deciding that some technology developed is something they want to acquire, and that would be considered a phase 3 award. Phase 3 is pretty wide open. It's really anything that that sort of continues your R&D towards commercialization after phase 1 and phase 2. So occasionally DOE does issue some, follow-on awards from the phase 2 by, a part of the agency, which would be classified as a phase 3. And once you have a phase 3, the thing to keep in mind, all those protections you have with an SBIR award in terms of data protection, your patent rights and things like that, all follow through from, your phase 1 and phase 2 award. Some types of awards may not have those kind of same data rights. And so you do want to, have those, during phase 3. But I'll turn it back over to Jason, because again, DoD, I believe, funds more in phase 3 than they do in phase 1 and phase 2.
That's exactly right. Yeah, phase 3 is a federal contract by its nature. When you're talking about the utilization of kind of what is phase 3 in the SBIR program and what does that mean for sole source or competition for the company. And phase 3 is really just a kind of a category. It's not a contract in and of itself. Phase 3 could be another transaction. It could be anything, any source of fiduciary exchange with the government. But what it means is that you're building off of the scope of the phase 2 or phase 1 on which it's being written. So when you come in through a phase, so if you talk about the kind of the traditional process, and DoD has some other stuff, we do direct to phase 2s, which is something that a lot of agencies can't do. But think about the kind of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. When you're coming through a phase 1, that is the full FAR-based open competition. That is where you compete directly. After that, we still have competitions inside of the Air Force for phase 2s and other activities, but it is no longer under that full and open competition banner. After phase 1, you can compete on the scope of that phase 1. So for phase 2s, for us, it's based upon what you did during phase 1. And it's the same thing as for phase 3. And like Rita said, you can do a phase 3 at any time. So, a company, a government, an Air Force agency can go right, Corsia phase 3 right now. That contract could be anything they want to. They make the scope determinations. So if I'm that Air Force agency, I can choose to compete and Corsia can compete, or I can go directly to Corsia, right? That's the Air Force agencies. It's not nothing to do with us on the SBIR side. We help to connect, like we talked before, customers, Air Force customers, to companies like Decode and Corsia, who are companies who we've given contracts to. But at the end of the day, we don't. That is the relationship between that organization and the company that they're doing business with. But yes, in the instance that the agency and the company want to do business together under that sole source prospectus, they can. It's absolutely 100% legal. It's been built into the SBIR statute since the very beginning. Again, to go back to why SBIR exists, to help small companies grow into bigger companies. I do also want to say, to Manny's point, we also care about you pushing your technology in the commercial sector. That is great as well. That's why we match private investment dollars. That's why we do business with private investors all the time. We're not in the business of turning companies into defense contractors. We want companies to be companies who sell into multiple markets. We're one market. I mean, we're one of many. So although I care about our market quite a bit, it's literally one of many, and that's our general approach. So phase 3s, yes, we do write them all the time. The Air Force writes them all the time. All DoD agencies do, and that's kind of how we get graded, how well we do on the SBIR side. But ultimately, we're right there with Manny as well, and want you to be successful in taking that technology to the commercial sector.
Okay, Manny, so related to that, I'd like to ask, based on your agency and how you handle things, how do you handle IP for the intellectual property for the companies that are coming in and developing under your phases for SBIR?
Yeah, so I did want those are good questions, because again, getting a government grant wasn't that many years ago that getting a government grant meant that the government retained the intellectual property rights for any of the R&D that's done. But through the Bayh-Dole Act that was actually celebrating its anniversary, I believe yesterday, I think for must be 40 years or so, those rights were granted to research institutions and small businesses. So through an SBIR award, you do get the intellectual property rights. The government does retain some rights, but those are really to protect the government's interest in certain cases where you choose to go after a commercial market, and the government, for example, would need it to satisfy some agency need or something. But the government is not really there to compete with you in the commercial market and give away your intellectual property. So you do have the right to file patents with the patent office based on the R&D. You should cite the award, the SBIR award, as the basis for doing that. And so, again, you can take that, you can license the technology from there. Now, with regard to the other thing to want to point out is that the funding that's provided through SBIR is R&D funding. So you can't take the research and development funding and also use it to pay for your patent filing costs. However, the agencies do have programs, either commercialization assistance type program, to help you. And you can use those commercialization assistance funds. And this is actually very recently, only from a couple of years ago, Congress changed the legislation on it. So you can use that as commercialization assistance funds for patent filing fees. that those funds currently are limited, and you'll have to discuss with the agencies how much they allow. But a lot of the agencies do use the maximum amount, which is 6,500 during phase 1 and 50,000 during phase 2. So we're probably looking more. We see more people using those type of funds during phase 2, in terms of retaining IP counsel or something to assist you with those filings.
Perfect. Ria, what do you see are the major pitfalls for people who are trying to apply for the SBIR programs?
Aside from filling out the proposal correctly, I'd probably say it's the explanation of how your technology or your product could solve a pain point of government. So a lot of times we'll see companies put together proposals that are like, this is our technology, these are the widgets we would like to do, and government, you will buy these widgets and you will enjoy them. I'm like, no, you need to always tie it back to a pain point, to a problem, and the solution you're providing. And the solution is bigger than just the technology that you are planning to build out with them. It's more of like putting together a narrative versus just throwing over like your technical white paper. So I'd say that's the biggest one, is how exactly you craft your narrative around how you solve a pain point. I think the other one is just, there are, like, I think we all mentioned on this panel, there are so many guidelines and so many little pieces specific to the instructions. And if you miss one, then you will be disqualified, like every government proposal. And so, like, there are compliance matrix templates on the interwebs too, and most of them are pretty good. And I'd recommend building a compliance matrix and very carefully ensuring you are using the right version of instructions and like checking all of the little boxes. That includes like where you have your page numbers, what font you're using, making sure that your PDF is PDF'd correctly. Like all of those little things could disqualify you, and that everyone would hate to have had to put in all this work, and then at the end of the day, like your header was incorrectly placed, and that screwed up your PDF, and then you couldn't get selected into the next round. So that's what I'd be very cognizant of, is following the instructions and following the right version of instructions.
Great. We're going to have a lightning round where each of you are going to answer this question. If you had one tip or recommendation to give to someone who wants to submit an SBIR, what would it be? Anusha, I'll start with you.
Sure, I will 100% agree on what Ria just said. You know, it's a shame to put in all of this effort into a proposal and then have it on a technicality not be able to be looked at. And I'll tell you from, painful experiences on our end, things like SAM registration, all of that is so important to get those ducks in a row before you get too close to the deadline. And I'll say it's probably hit us twice. The first time, we think we just didn't get our SAM in early enough. And in fact, just recently, even with this round of proposals, we had a company name change, and it has a trickle effect once you're actually already under contract. So really, all of those things that don't need to be a problem if you start early, start early.
Manny, off to you.
Yeah, I would say take advantage. Agencies, DOE has done this since 2012. We have what we call a letter of intent requirement, but you're going to give us a sort of a brief 500-word summary of what you're proposing to us, and we'll give you feedback on that if it doesn't look like it's going to be responsive to the to DOE. And NSF has something called a project pitch, which is a similar type thing where you initially give us a much briefer introduction to your project, and that saves you the time of having to put a whole application together if that's not something that's going to be a good fit for the agency.
Ria, your turn.
Keep mine quick. One, SBIR is not a panacea of government growth. So do not think that if you win an SBIR, all of a sudden your government sales is just going to explode within the next year. It is one vehicle, one tool of many tools and vehicles to generate a successful and sustainable federal practice, which leads me to my second point of SBIR and continuing to apply to every SBIR you think is relevant to you is not a sustainable federal growth model. And I would recommend you not treat it as such.
And Jason, last but not least.
Please go to the appworks.af.mil, go to the SBIR website and check out how to apply. I mean, that's my advice. We're excited. We've got solicitations open right now. We've been breaking records every time for a number of applicants, and certainly looking forward to reading your proposal when it comes in.
All right, and then to wrap things up, I'm going to do another round the horn and let everyone sort of give their closing comments or remarks about the SBIR process or anything that they would like to talk about. Manny, I'll start with you since we were woefully behind in being able to let you contribute.
Like I said, from what we've seen and how it's helped the companies we have funded, and this varies a little by agency, but a lot of times if you have some little further out ideas and you really need the funding to to reduce it to practice, the SBIR is really the best funding you can get to do that. And we've seen companies take that and be very successful in getting follow-on private investment just from leveraging that. The challenge up front, there's a learning curve in terms of understanding the SBIR program. Unfortunately, Congress didn't just say, oh, here's the SBIR office, all the proposals go in here, and the proposals are short and easy. They didn't do it that way, unfortunately. They basically said, no, the agencies are going to have to run them. They're going to have to come in through their standard grant and contract processes we have in place. And so that has made it a little burdensome. So along with that, I would say, you're going to have to invest a little time in learning about, the agency, its mission, and what you're applying for, and why the programs are so different. There are a lot of groups out there who can help you with that. A lot of the bigger universities and, most states have something called a Small Business Development Center. And there are plenty of other sort of networks, incubators, such as the one Ria's from, that really can provide you some early guidance on that. But at some point, you're going to have to sort of learn your way through, figure out what's the right agency or agencies for you to apply to, and then go from there. But I think we've seen so many companies successfully leverage it that it would be a shame for you to pass that up.
Thank you, Jason.
I mean, the SBIR program can do a lot of really unique things that I think other sources of government funding cannot do. It caters to R&D activity in technology, small businesses, and startups. We've seen incredible returns from the SBIR program and its ability to invest in new and emergent technologies that really help the public good. And so, I couldn't speak highly enough for the program and what I think it's meant to the economy. But I recommend, there's no way of learning about it other than trying. Like Ria said, we probably select 20% of the companies that apply every round. Sometimes less. During the pandemic hit, we had a uptick in the number of companies who applied, and I think we were down to 10% at one point. And that's just with the funding that we have available, doing the best we can. But we've seen companies apply a few times and eventually solicit feedback. We're always up, just like Manny's office, and providing feedback with proposals. But really, there is no time like the present to apply and try it out and see if it works. I will mention, we didn't talk about this, but the SBIR program does apply to small businesses under 500 employees that are domestically owned. They have to be, 51% of the ownership has to be in the US. So unfortunately, if the company is incorporated internationally, they're not eligible for the SBIR program. And I did want to make sure that was apparent in case there's some folks from outside the US on the call today.
Okay, Anusha, over to you, please.
Yeah, I guess, just closing thoughts. It's obviously been a great experience for us. I think it's the SBIR program is a fantastic way for early companies to engage with the government. And I think, Jen, as you mentioned, it is substantial, non-dilutive funding. It can be transformational for a young, early company. And also, it's a great way to validate your technology with a real, substantial, serious customer. So highly recommend it.
And finally, Ria, over to you.
It's great. Everyone said things that I would probably say, so I'll be like 30 seconds. It's a great entry point, but it's still a complicated entry point because it's an entry point to federal government. So there are a ton of, I see it even in the chat, there are a ton of resources out there, and definitely leverage those resources. There are free resources. There are resources for every different kind of company. Decode in particular, we work with high growth tech startups who have a dual use application of their product, but have already sort of worked in commercial a little bit. There are folks who are working more on the earlier stage or like pre-product. And so you have a whole ecosystem ready to help you because it's a really complicated entry point nonetheless. So definitely leverage those resources.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We had a few technical difficulties starting us off, but I think we ended on a smooth note. So I appreciate all of your efforts and your insightful comments today. Cynthia, I will hand it over to you for the wrap up.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much to our panel, Jason, Manny, Anusha, Ria, and our terrific moderator, Jen. And thank all of you for joining us. Apologies for the technical difficulties, but I'm glad we made it through. We pushed this event out to our global enterprise forum community, and I'm happy to report that we had people joining us from around the world. And to Jason's point, happy to have our international friends. Really glad that we could have a lot of interested parties from across the US. And so thank you to all of you from across all the time zones for joining us. You can find more information on our organization, and more importantly, a copy of this and all of our events on our website. That's mitefdc.org. That's also where you can check out our podcast series, Cutting Edge, hosted by our very own board member, Larry Trotter. We've got a number of podcasts out there, and we anticipate doing a follow-up to this event as a podcast. So I would strongly encourage you to check that out on our website or wherever you find your favorite podcast. We have several other events lined up for the coming months, including a November discussion regarding innovation and autism, and a CEO pitch and business challenge that we would invite you to apply to and definitely invite you to tune into. And we're looking to do something light and fun and virtual for the holidays in lieu of our typical holiday get-together. So I'd say stay tuned for that. Again, thanks to all of you for joining us. Thanks for the courtesy of your time and your interest. Thank you so much to our terrific panel. I hope everyone has a great rest of the week. Stay dry and stay safe. So thanks again. Bye now.